Brajajanaranja Yashodanandana Brajajanaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jum Vishpat Varman Chakravyakcha Shlukta Sadasya Srimati Sangha Srimati Vedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. ISKCON संस्थापकाचार्य श्रील प्रभुपाद की जय। जय विश्वपाल परमहंस प्रत्यक्ष अष्टोत्तर सदस्य श्रीमद् भक्ति सिद्धांत सरस्वती गोस्वामी महाराज प्रभुपाद की जय। अनंत कोटि वैष्णव की जय। आचार्य श्री हरिदास ठाकुर की जय। प्रेम से श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत दादर श्री गौर भक्तवृंद की जय। All glories to the assembly. This all glories to the assembly. This all glories to the assembly. This all glories to Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga. All glories to Shri Prabhupada ki jai. Hare Krishna. So welcome you all to this Saturday morning Srimad Bhagavatam summary study class. We are today discussing from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, chapter 27, text 16 to 30 onwards. So in the previous slokas, the previous speaker has discussed about this up to sloka number 15, wherein there is a conversation between Mother Devhuti and Lord Kapila Dev. And in this slokas, he has explained about how to realize the presence of soul without the material covering, the material coverings, the subtle covering, that is mind intelligence and false ego. So in the sloka number 16, which is a conclusion of this part of it, he says that when by mature understanding one can realize his individuality, then the situation he accepts under false ego becomes manifest to him. So the point is that there are three important points in this sloka. One is a knower, one is the knowable, that means to know whom to know about, and the third is a knowledge. And all these three are different individual matters, and they are all individuals only and will continue to be in individuality. Now, we see everything due to our false ego in illusion. For example, we said that when we are in deep sleep, we don't know what is going on. This deep sleep also happens when goes through the final destruction of the universe, which is called the universal destructions. At that time, we don't know what's going on. When we are dreaming also, we are lost. And unfortunately, when we are awake also, since we don't see anything and everything in the right perspective, and we see everything as separate from Krishna, we see everything in illusion. So we are in a place of duality. For example, we might be sitting and discussing in an air-conditioned room when the temperature is very, very hot. And after we finish, when we go out, we feel very uncomfortable, and vice versa also. So we may be sitting in an air-conditioned car, and when we get out, when the weather is very hot, we'll be very uncomfortable. Now, the heat and the cold, they don't affect the soul within the body. But because we are engaged in this material body, we identify ourselves due to our false ego with this body and identify with these dualities also. So this is basically because of false identification, and that is the basic principle of this conditioned life. But however, when the false ego is purified, then looks at everything in the right perspective, and that is what is called the stage of liberation, which is what is mentioned in this 16th sloka. So generally, we tend to think in this material world that I am what all that is there, and I am the enjoyer. Everything belongs to me, and everything is meant for me to enjoy. And this concept continues for birth after birth until one understands what is the real truth. And that happens when the false ego is eliminated. That is when one is liberated. In the spiritual plane, we come to understand that, for example, if somebody loses his wealth, he thinks that I'm lost. He has lost his wealth. He is not lost. Not that wealth was that particular individual's person's. Everything comes from Krishna. Everything belongs to Krishna. And Krishna gives all these things to a person for use in his service. Now, unfortunately, we claim everything to be ours. And so when it is lost, we say that Wealth is lost, I am also lost. Similarly, if we see, a boy might see a girl from a different perspective, but the girl's mother might look at the girl as her daughter. A teacher might look at her as a student. A pure devotee might look at her as a part and parcel of the Supreme Lord and how she can go back to Godhead. For the Lord, everyone is a part and parcel and everyone is the same. That is, the spirit soul within everyone is the same. So for the Lord, there is no difference. In a sense, what happens is that in this verse, due to identification with our false ego, we identify more with the false ego and its byproducts, that is the mind, intelligence, and also the false ego. So this is how Kapil Dev explains that one can see the presence of soul in a pure state of consciousness, which is free from the false ego. Now, from text number 17 to text number 30, Mother Devahuti is asking a question about the rarity of liberation. So in text 17, she is asking, my dear Brahmana, does material nature ever give release to the spirit soul? Since one is attracted to the other eternally, how is their separation possible? So it's explained as to how spirit, soul, and matter, these are two different products. Now, matter does not have any effect on its own without contact with the spirit soul. But however, in this material world, we see that their separation is actually not possible, either by philosophical speculation or by proper understanding. Now, the spirit soul that is within us is the marginal potency of the Lord, whereas the matter is an external potency of the Lord. These two eternal potencies are somehow or other combined, and when they are separate on their own, now one cannot realize himself, or one cannot understand the body itself without the presence of soul, because without the soul, the body is dead. So that also has no meaning. But however, what happens is in this material world, when we come here, these two combine together and they are attached to each other, just as a man is attached to a woman and a woman is attached to a man, they are attached to each other. And they very difficult to separate them from each other. So as long as the soul and body are combined, we can understand, yes, there is life. But when they are separated, there is no manifested experience or existence of the body or the soul. So normally the impersonalists say that everything is Maya, and voidists say that afterwards everything becomes zero. So she is asking a question, does this material nature ever give release to the spirit soul? In the next sloka, that is sloka number 18, she gives an example. As there is no separate existence of the earth and its aroma, or of water and its taste, there cannot be any separate existence of intelligence and consciousness. Which is true. Now, wherever there is anything that is material, there is aroma. When there is earth, there is an aroma. Sometimes we go for a morning walk, early morning walk, we see there is a very pleasant smell. So there is an aroma and there is an earth also. Now, they both cannot be separated. So similarly, water, as long as there is water, there is a taste in the water. We might see some places that water is very sweet, and somewhere we see water is very salty. Similarly, heat and fire, they are always together. They can never be separated. Wherever there is fire, there is heat. So similarly, she mentioned, giving these examples, she says that when there is want of intelligence, spirit has no meaning. And we have means even though he is the passive performer of all activities, how can there be freedom for the soul as long as material nature acts on him and binds him? It's a very important sloka. Now, the soul does not perform activities, but when it is there in the body performs activities. Now, one performs these activities in a passive manner. One, as we see even in Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna asked a question to Krishna. How is it that one is impelled to sinful activities, even though that he knows that it is sinful and he does not want to perform? So he is something very similar here. that one is goes on performing activities even though he may not want to do it. Under these circumstances, Mother Devahuti is asking, how can there be freedom for the soul as long as the material nature keeps binding him? So the living entity still desires freedom. The spirit soul is actually a part and parcel, and he wants to be released from this material world. But he is not given release by this material nature. So as long as a living entity puts himself under the control of these three modes of material nature, his activities are influenced by the qualities of this material nature, and he becomes passive. He becomes rather submissive to this material nature. So even Bhagavad Gita 27, third chapter, 27 sloka, Lord explained the living entity acts according to the qualities of the modes of material nature. Actually, he is falsely thinking that he is acting, but unfortunately, he is passive. In other words, he has no opportunity to get out of the control of material nature because he has already been conditioned there. Lord himself says in Bhagavad Gita, Daivi Esha Gunamai Mama Maya Duratya. This divine energy of mind consisting of the three modes of material nature is very difficult to overcome, but those who have surrendered unto me can easily cross beyond it. So that particular point is going to be explained, given as following answers by Lord Kapila Dev. So Devahuti asked this question so that one may not speculate as to how liberation can be obtained under the spell of the three modes of material nature. So gradually, Devahuti is also coming to a point of what is called surrender. Our questions are very intelligent. So as to how can one be liberated? How can one be in a pure state of spiritual existence as long as he is strongly held by the modes of material nature? Now, the material nature is such that the jiva also wants to take shelter of Prakriti, and Prakriti also, vice versa, wants to take shelter of the jiva. Text number 20. She comes to this last part, question to Lord Kapila, before Lord Kapila starts answering. She says, even if the great fear of bondage is avoided by mental speculation and inquiry into the fundamental principles, it may still appear again since its cause has not been ceased. So, material bondage is caused by putting oneself under the control of this matter because of the false ego of lording over it. As I mentioned in the beginning of the class, there are two kinds of propensities that all the living entities have. One propensity is icha, which means the desire to lord it over the material nature or be as great. Second one is be as great as the Supreme Lord. Everyone wants to be the greatest personality in this material world. And the other one is dvesha, which means envy. When one becomes envious of Krishna or the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then one starts thinking, why should Krishna be the all in all? Why I am not as good as Krishna? So these two items, that is Icha and Dvesha, a desire to lord over and envy of the Lord, are the beginning causes of the material bondage. So Devahuti very intelligently says, one may theoretically analyze all these things and say that come to an understanding by knowledge that he has become freed. But as long as the cause exists, he is not free. So there is material nature is a cause, but ultimately Supreme Lord is the cause of all causes. So she says that you taught me the Sankhya philosophy before in the previous slokas about the analysis of the various elements. But still the root cause has not been eliminated. So Bhagavad Gita confirms that after performing such speculative activities for many, many births, when one actually comes to the understanding of real consciousness and surrenders unto the Supreme Lord, then the fulfillment of all his research in knowledge becomes complete and he has achieved. So there is a big difference between theoretical freedom and the actual freedom from material bondage. So Bhagavatam 10th Canto explains that if one gives up the auspicious path of devotional service and simply tries to speculate, then one wastes his valuable time. The result of such a labor of love is simply waste. there is no result. So the labor of speculation is ended only by exhaustion. The example is given that there is no benefit in husking the skin of an empty paddy. The rice is already gone from the paddy, so there is no point in husking that. Similarly, by speculative process, one cannot be freed from material bondage because the cause is still existing. So one has to remove that, eliminate that cause, and then the effect will be nullified. Then from text 21 onwards, Lord Kapila, after the next three slokas, he explains, recommends about the practice for eliminating the cause. So we'll read some important slokas. Say Bhagavan Vacha, Animitta Nimittena Sadharme Namalatmanha Tivrayamai Bhaktya Cha Sutat Samvritaya Chiram. So in the translation, he says, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, one can get liberation by seriously discharging devotional service unto me and thereby hearing for a long time about me or from me. By thus executing one's prescribed duties, there will be no reaction and one will be freed from the contamination of matter. So here, one of the acharyas in our Sampradaya, Srila Tirtha Swami, actually is explaining that if someone is in contact with the police department, that does not mean that he becomes a criminal. One may be a jailer or he may be an inspector, but just because they are in the police department, one does not be a criminal. Similarly, a liberated soul is not affected by the three modes of material nature, although he may be in this material world itself. One is infected by being infected by that is, one is affected. One becomes affected by the modes of material nature by being infected by these three modes. One example is even the Supreme Personality of God. He is transcendent to the three modes of material nature. When he appears in this material world, he acts in this material world, but he does not get affected. So one has to be acting in such a way in this material world that material nature does not affect him and thereby leading to contamination. Another example is that like a lotus flower. When it's in the water, the flower is above the water. It does not mix with the water. So similarly, one who is a liberated from these three modes, liberated condition, does not associate with the three modes of material nature in this material world. And then he gives a solution here. He says that one can get liberated from all adverse circumstances simply by engaging seriously in devotion service. Seriously. So the seriously is a very important point here. So how this devotional service develops and becomes mature is explained in this verse. He says that one has to perform his prescribed duties in Krishna consciousness. So whatever we perform, we have to simply act and perform those duties as a service to Krishna. So when we perform the duties in Krishna consciousness, these could determine whether it could be professional duties or occupational duties. But when we perform these duties as a service to Krishna, then Krishna becomes satisfied. And when Krishna becomes satisfied, then everyone becomes satisfied. So if one wants to perfect his life, he should discharge his prescribed duties for satisfaction of Krishna. One must act in Krishna consciousness because such an action will never produce any reaction in this material world. Otherwise, any action that is performed keeps us bound in this material world. The next point is that this serious devotional service can develop by hearing for a long periods of time. It is not that I hear one class or two class and immediately it has an immediate effect on me because we've been conditioned for many births. So when one hears for a very long period of time, one develops the attitude to perform devotion service very seriously, intensely. So chanting and hearing about the Lord is the beginning of the process of the devotional service, that is Shravanam and Kirtanam. And for this, one should associate with devotees of the Lord and hear from them about the Lord's transcendental appearance, pastimes, activities, instructions, etc. So how does one hear? That is explained also in the last para of this particular purport, where it says that there are two kinds of Shruti. or scriptures. One is spoken by the Lord and the other is by the Lord. One is spoken by the Lord and the other is spoken about the Lord and his devotees. So Bhagavad Gita is spoken by the Lord himself, whereas Srimad Bhagavatam is spoken by the Lord's devotees. So one must hear both the Shruti and Smriti repeatedly from reliable sources in order to become fixed in serious devotional service. So if one wants to be fixed in serious devotional service, one must hear from pure devotees of the Lord, and then they become fixed. Through engagement in such devotional service, one becomes freed from the contamination of Maya. So when one starts hearing, for example, rainwater is very clear, but when it falls down, it becomes, when it associates with mud, the mud mixes with mud, the water becomes dirty. But then the same water is again purified through a process. Similarly, when one hears and about the glories of the Lord from Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, one gradually becomes purified and one becomes freed from the contamination of Maya. So it is stated in Srimad Bhagavatam also that hearing about the Supreme Personality of Godhead cleanses the heart of all the contamination that is caused by the influence of the three modes of material nature. So by continuous, regular hearing, the effects of the contamination of lust, greed, we have 6 anarthas: lust, anger, greed, pride, madness, and illusion. Lust, anger, greed, envy, pride, and illusion. So in this way, this is the beginning process of the cleaning. And when gradually, when lust and greed diminish, one becomes situated in the mode of goodness. And when one comes to the mode of goodness, that is the beginning stage of Brahman realization or spiritual realization. And this way, by becoming fixed on the transcendental platform, one performs devotional service. And then gradually, one gets liberated from the material entanglement. So in effect, the summary of this sloka is that one should perform your activities for Krishna without expecting results, and one should perform intense devotional by hearing about the Lord. Then we come to text number 22. Jnanena drishta tattvena vairagyena baliyasa tapoyuktena yogena tivrenatma samadhina. Translation is, this devotional service has to be performed strongly in perfect knowledge and with transcendental vision. One must be strongly renounced and must engage in austerity and perform mystic yoga in order to be firmly fixed in self-absorption. So the point is that one has to perform devotional service in full knowledge by visualizing the absolute truth. We can understand the absolute truth by transcendental knowledge, and that result of knowledge will be manifested by renunciation. That renunciation is not temporary and it is not artificial, but rather it is very, very strong. So if one wants to practice Krishna consciousness, one must actually understand, have some knowledge of the absolute truth. And when one understands this transcendental knowledge, then what happens is that automatically one starts developing renunciation, which is permanent. If one does not separate himself from this material enjoyment, it is to be understood that he is not advancing in Krishna consciousness. That means if one performs some devotional service, at the same time, he has got a desire to enjoy material fruitive results, that means one is not progressing in Krishna consciousness. But renunciation in Krishna consciousness is so strong that it cannot be deviated by any attractive illusion. So one has to reach a stage by performing serious devotional service that automatically that renunciation results in one negating the desire to enjoy this material world. So one has to perform this devotional service fully in tapasya or austerity. So devotional service is an austerity, it's a tapasya. And when one is serious, then one can actually feel the renunciation develop. We also might see that many times when we are chanting, we lose results and many other things. That is because we have realized, yes, there is no taste in this material enjoyment. In fact, over a period of time, one becomes frustrated. Suppose there is an alcoholic. He may drink for some time. He might become an extreme alcoholic also, but then it drives him to a point that he doesn't want to drink anymore. Or if a person is smoking, he may become a chain smoker. But gradually, when he starts performing devotion service, he also becomes frustrated about this drinking or smoking. He wants to give it up. But then automatically, when he starts performing devotion service, the taste for these substandard things automatically reduces. So in effect, in text, the summary, I would like to summarize the text 21 and 22. One can get liberation by intense practice that includes Tivraya Bhakti Acharam, that is intense bhakti for a long time. Animitta Nimittena, that is without desire for fruitive results. Swadharmena, that is by executing prescribed duties. Shuddha Samvrataya, that means by nourishing oneself by hearing about the Lord. Jnanena Vairagyena, with perfect knowledge and which results in detachment. And Tapoyuktena Yogena Atma Samadhina, that means one has to perform this with austerity, perform yoga, by which one will be self-absorbed. So actually, one important point is that one should always pray to the Lord for protection of one's soul. And at the same time, one should also have a fear that one should not fall down into this material world. One of the greatest fear that one should have is that about the fear of Maya. In fact, Srila Prabhupada always said that if at all that one should have fear in this material world, it should be a fear of Maya, because Maya is so powerful that one cannot overcome that. It can come to anyone at any time in any form. One need not even realize that it is coming to them. Then in text number 23, he says, Prakriti Purushasyeha Dahyamana Harinisham Tiro Bhavitrishtanakar Agneryonir Ivaranihi. The translation is, the influence of material nature has covered the living entity, and thus it is as if the living entity were always in a blazing fire. But by the process of furiously discharging devotional service, this influence can be removed, just as wooden sticks which cause a fire are themselves consumed by it. So there is a very nice example Lord Kapila is explaining to Mother Devahuti here. It says, now actually fire is conserved in the wooden sticks, and when circumstances are favorable, the fire is automatically ignited. One does not have the struggle to put fire because the fire is already there within these wooden sticks. So, but the wooden sticks which are the cause of fire are also consumed by the fire if it is properly dealt with. So suppose when fire takes place, by the time the fire is over, the wooden sticks are all exhausted. They are all consumed by the fire itself. Then, so he explains that similarly, the living entity's conditional life of material existence is due to his desire to lord over the material nature and due to his envy of the Supreme Lord. So two things. One is we have a desire to enjoy this material world. Always we think, how can I enjoy and how can I exploit this to my maximum for the satisfaction for my own self. Whereas everything is meant for service, utilization, the service of the Lord. And the second is due to one's envy of the Supreme Lord. So thus his main diseases are that he wants to be, ultimately when everything gets exhausted, he thinks that this doesn't happen, that doesn't happen. He wants to become one with the Lord. That I should also be God. Why only Lord is there? God is there. I should also be God. So the karmis, they want to try to utilize the hardcore materialists. They want to try to use the resources of this material nature as much as possible and just try to lord over it and enjoy for their sense gratification. Whereas the jnanis or salvationists, they think they actually over a period of time, they become frustrated in enjoying these material resources. They want to become one with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, or they want to merge into his impersonal effulgence. So this is one important subject matter in this particular chapter about impersonal Brahman effulgence. So both these are diseases due to material contamination. So, but whereas this material contamination can be completely consumed by this process of devotional service, Because in devotional service, both these two diseases, namely to the desire to lord it over and the desire to become one with the Supreme Lord, both are absent. So it is mentioned as to how a devotee in full Krishna consciousness actually appears superficially. Externally, one might think a devotee is also performing duties, but it is an external, but is always working for the satisfaction of the Lord. Internally, is working for the satisfaction of the Lord. So this is what is called bhakti or devotional service. So bhakti means sarvopadi nirmuktam tatparat ena nirmanam rishikena rishikesha sevanam bhakti ruchate. When the services of senses of a living entity are engaged in the satisfaction of the services of the Supreme Lord, that is what is called bhakti. The next is the jnanis or salvationists who have become frustrated in enjoying the material resources, want to become one with the Supreme Lord, or they want to merge into the impersonal Brahmajyoti. So both are diseases due to material contamination, and this material contamination can be consumed by the process of devotional service itself, just like fire consumes the wooden sticks in which the fire is already built in. Now, from text number 24 to 26, actually, he further goes on to explain that by performing devotional service, how Prakriti or material nature cannot bring harm to an enlightened soul. So we go to text number 24. Bhukta Bhoga Pratyakta Drishtadosha Chadityasaha Nishparasya Bhusham Shubham Datte Sve Mahimni Stitasya Cha. He says, by discovering the faultiness of his desiring to lord it over material nature, and by therefore giving it up, the living entity becomes independent and stands in his own glory. So, the important point here is, the living entity is not actually meant to enjoy this material world or material resources. But because one had a desire to enjoy separately from the Lord has given an opportunity to come to this material world and understand the true nature. But then when he comes here, he thinks that he can enjoy these material resources. But then one's attempt to lord it over does not fructify. Rather, one becomes frustrated over a period in the process of enjoyment. So as a result of frustration, then one desires more power than other living entities, and thus wants to merge into the existence of the supreme enjoyer, that is the Lord. So this way he makes a lot of plan for the greater the enjoyment. So we see that when one gets frustrated at the lower levels of enjoyment, one makes a lot of plan. How can I enjoy further? How can I enjoy further? They make several plans, but all those plans fail because ultimately there is only one alternative for all this, that is to become free from this material world, and that is to become independent. Now, generally, people don't know what is independence and what is dependent. That is what is explained in this verse. So when one is actually situated in devotion service, that is his independent position. So what happens is that normally people get aversion when we use the name servant. Now, they don't know what is the actual meaning of a servant. We all have a tendency to serve. We have, because constitutionally we are meant to serve. The soul has to serve the super soul. When it is in this material body, the body also is meant to serve the Supreme Lord. But we don't know whom to serve. But because we are averse to serving the Supreme Lord, we have developed an attraction to serve Maya. That Maya could be our employer, it could be the family, it could be the opulence, it could be so many other things. Material attractions are so many forms and nature. So one automatically becomes a servant if he doesn't want to be a servant also. Only thing is, instead of serving Krishna, one is serving Maya. So, but when one actually starts rendering service to the Lord, he is a servant. But by doing this service to the Lord, one becomes independent. So that is what is the self-realization. If one can understand that one is a part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, and that it is the constitutional position of the part and parcel to serve the supreme whole. That is one's self-realization, by which one becomes fully independent. One does not have to depend on anyone in this material world. The moment one depends on the Supreme Lord, one becomes independent of everything in this material world. Otherwise, everyone is bound in this material world. We may be thinking, because we don't know the laws of the material nature, we are all bound in this material world by these two desires which I have explained before. But when we take to devotional service to the Lord, we are independent because we are not bound by this material laws or the material world. So a living entity's independence is lost by material contact. So actually we are fully independent. By serving the Lord, we become independent. But by abstaining Him, we depend on this material world and become bound. In the spiritual world, here one has full independence, because there is no question of becoming dependent upon the three modes of material nature. No one is bound by the three modes of material nature in the spiritual world. Whereas here one becomes bound. This position is attained by a devotee, and therefore he gives up the tendency for material enjoyment after seeing its faultiness. That means when one tries to enjoy and then over a period of time gets frustrated, one realizes that what he tries to enjoy is actually faulty. There cannot be, one can never become an enjoyer. We are all meant to be enjoyed, but by the Supreme Lord. But by taking the process through the process of devotion service, one becomes independent. Now, the difference between a devotee and an impersonalist is that an impersonalist thinks that he should become one with the Lord so that he can enjoy without impediment. He thinks that the Lord is enjoying, so I can also enjoy like the Lord. Whereas a devotee gives up the total enjoying mentality and engages in transcendental loving service of the Lord. This is his constitutional position, and it is always glorified in all the scriptures. At that time, he is also Ishvara, or fully independent. The real Ishvara, or the supreme Ishvara or supreme independent, is Krishna. But the living entity is Ishvara when he becomes engaged in the loving service of the Lord. In other words, one derives transcendental pleasure by rendering service to the Lord, and that is the actual independence. So, in spiritual the world, there is no master, there is no servant. Everyone is rendering service only for the satisfaction of the Lord. Whereas in the material world, everyone is subservient to everything else in this world. And not only that, everything is temporary. But somehow people become averse to being named as a servant. Whereas we are servants only. By nature, we are servants. We have bound to serve. Then we go to text number 25. Yeah. Here the translation, he says, in the dreaming state, one's consciousness is almost covered and one sees many inauspicious things. But when he is awakened and fully conscious, such inauspicious things cannot bewilder him. So normally we see when one is dreaming, one's consciousness is almost covered. He doesn't know what he is dreaming, what he is doing. One might see that imagine that he is becoming a big billionaire, but then actually it's a dream only, and he doesn't know that he has not become a billionaire. So one might see many unfavorable things also, which may cause some disturbance or anxiety. But the moment one wakes up, although he remembers what happened in the dream, he's not disturbed. In a dream, one might disturb when we see something inauspicious. One might dream that he's getting drowned in the river or something. But when he wakes up, he might remember the dream that he's getting drowned in the river. But what happens is that he's not disturbed. Similarly, the position of self-realization or understanding of one's relationship with the Supreme Lord makes one completely satisfied. And the three modes of nature, which are cause of all disturbances, cannot affect him. So, when one is awake, now one is asleep to the process of self-realization. it is as good as one's dreaming. Whereas when one is awake, one is awakened to Krishna consciousness, or one has taken the spiritual path of perfection. So the position of self-realization or understanding is that one makes it makes one completely satisfied. And the three modes of material nature, which causes all the disturbances, does not affect such a person. So when one is situated in the process of self-realization and attains perfection, one is not affected anymore by the three modes of material nature. In a contaminated consciousness, one sees everything to be for his own enjoyment. But in Krishna, in pure consciousness or Krishna consciousness, he sees that everything exists for the enjoyment of the supreme enjoyer, that is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So that is the difference between a state of dream and a state of wakefulness. The state of contaminated consciousness is compared to the dream consciousness, and the Krishna consciousness is compared to the awakened stage of life. So in this awakened stage of Krishna consciousness, one can understand that Krishna is the proprietor of all the three worlds, and that he is the friend of everyone. When one understands this, he becomes peaceful and independent. Also, the Lord also says in Bhagavad Gita, Bhoktaram Yajnatapatha Sarvaloka Maheshwaram. The Lord is a supreme proprietor and a supreme enjoyer, and one who understands this and who knows this, he becomes peaceful. So here also, Lord Kapila explains that when one knows that Krishna is the proprietor, Krishna is also the friend of everyone. He's our supreme father. So he's a friend for us also. He's our well-wisher also. And when one knows this, one becomes peaceful and independent. But as long as one does not have this transcendental knowledge and wants to enjoy everything in this material world, then he wants to become either a humanitarian or a philanthropist and open hospitals and schools for his fellow beings. So if one does not take to this process of Krishna consciousness, ultimately one becomes frustrated in life. And finally, we see that many people take up the process of charity, opening hospitals, schools, etc. Or he might become a philanthropist. Text number 26. Yeah. Here Lord Kapila says, the influence of material nature cannot harm an enlightened soul, even though he engages in material activities, because he knows the truth of the Absolute, and his mind is fixed on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So an enlightened soul is one on whom material nature has no effect. So even though one may be engaged in activities in this material world, one is not affected by the activities that he performs, because he is performing everything for satisfaction of the Lord. So here a word Atma Rama is used. Atma Rama means one who rejoices in the self, or one who enjoys the spiritual atmosphere. So Atma in this material sense means body and mind. And when referring to one whose mind is fixed on the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord, Atma Rama means one who is fixed in his spiritual life in relationship with the Supreme Soul. The Lord is also called Atma Rama because the Lord is always fully satisfied. Similarly, our position is such that we are also called Atma Ramas when we are fixed in the lotus through the means of devotion service at the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord. And when we are fixed in devotion service, we also have satisfaction of our own self. We are fully satisfied. We never have any disgruntlement, even when we perform activities in this material world, because we are not expecting any fruitive activities, rather we are doing everything as a service to Krishna. So this Atmarama position can be attained by one who knows the truth as it is. The truth is that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the enjoyer, and the living entities are meant for his service and enjoyment. So ultimately, all of us are meant to serve the Lord and give pleasure to the Lord, by which we also derive pleasure. Just as one waters the root of a tree, all the leaves and branches also get the water. Similarly, when we water the root of the tree, which is the Supreme Lord, by rendering devotion service, all the part and parcel also get the fruits of it. Another example is that we when the food goes into our stomach and the food gets digested, the energy is transmitted to all the parts of the body. So similarly, when one renders service to Krishna, we also get nourished. And one who knows this truth and who tries to engage all resources in the service of the Lord, he escapes all material reactions and in the influences of the three modes of material nature. So an example is given here in this sloka. For example, a materialist might build a multi-story, big, huge skyscraper, whereas a devotee might construct a temple for Lord Vishnu. Superficially, the constructor, temple are all on the same level. They all externally look, uh, uh, externally, they are all built of wood, stone, iron, and so many other building materials. But the person who constructs a skyscraper is a materialist, whereas a person who builds a temple for Vishnu is an Atmarama because he builds it for the satisfaction of the Lord. The materialist tries to satisfy himself in relation to his body by constructing a skyscraper, but a devotee tries to satisfy the super self, the supreme self personality of Godhead, by constructing the temple. So, although both are engaged in the association of material activities, the devotee is liberated. So, this is a very simple example how one can liberate himself in this material world by doing everything in the service of Krishna. A devotee becomes liberated this way, whereas a materialist becomes bound and conditioned in this material world. This is because the devotee who is constructing the temple has fixed his mind on the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but the non-devotee who is constructing the skyscraper has his mind fixed on sense gratification. He thinks how much money I can make, how much pride I can have by developing this, building this beautiful skyscraper. So he looks at name frame from this material world and he becomes bound. So if while performing any activity, even in this material existence, one's mind is fixed upon the lotus feet of the Lord, one will not be entangled or conditioned. So I just want to summarize this verse itself. The summary is Prakriti cannot harm him because he knows the absolute truth. He has fixed his mind on the Lord and he reaches by the performance of devotional service. He rejoices in his own self. Now we come to text number 27. Now text number 27 to 30, the final liberation of a practicing yogi is explained. So 27. When a person thus engages in devotional service and self-realization, when a person thus engages in devotional service and self-realization for many, many years and births, he becomes completely reluctant to enjoy any one of the material planets, even up to the highest planet, which is known as Brahmaloka. He becomes fully developed in Krishna consciousness. Very important words from God. So, anyone who is engaged in devotional service to the Lord is known as a devotee. But there is a distinction between a mixed devotee and a pure devotee. A mixed devotee engages in devotional service, but at the same time, he is expecting some results from these activities that he performs. So, in material existence, when a devotee is not completely purified, he expects some benefit from the Lord in the form of relief from material miseries, or he wants material gain, advancement in knowledge of relationship between him and the Lord, or knowledge as to the real nature of Lord. Something, he expects some material benefit. That is called a mixed devotee. When a person is transcendental to these conditions, he is called a pure devotee. He does not engage himself in the service of the Lord for any personal sense gratification or for any material benefit. His only interest is that he loves the Supreme Personality of Godhead and spontaneously engages in satisfying him. So unless one is advanced to this stage of pure consciousness or pure devotional service, there is a desire to elevate oneself to even higher material positions. For example, a mixed devotee might desire to enjoy a comfortable life. For example, by performing charitable activities, opening hospitals, schools, giving in charity, one may be elevated to higher planets that are the heavenly planets. Whereas where there are multiple levels or different types of enjoyments in heavenly planets in terms of beauty, opulence, etc. But A mixed devotee like that might have a desire to enjoy such things, opulence in the higher planets. So, a devotee who is purely practicing devotion services to the Lord does not even have these material desires because he is firmly fixed in the Supreme Lord. These are all material desires for higher enjoyment. But after many lifetimes of these types of material enjoyment, then one undoubtedly develops Krishna consciousness. And the symptoms of this Krishna consciousness is such that one no longer is interested in any sort of materially elevated life. He does not aspire even to become a personality like Lord Brahma. Lord Brahma resides in Brahmaloka, which is one of the highest planets. So one does not even desires to enter into Brahmaloka or desires to become Brahma when becomes frustrated in all sorts of material enjoyment. But this comes after many lifetimes of this practice of mixed devotional service. Text number 28 and text number 29. I'll read this sloka, it's very important. Madbhakta Patibuddharto Matprasadena Bhuyasa Nirsheyasam Swasamsthanam Kaivalyakya Madashrayam Prapnot Tihanjasa Dhiraha Sadrisha Chinna Samshayah Yad Gatvana Nivarteta Teta Yogilinga Vinirgame. The translation says, my devotee actually becomes self-realized by my unlimited costless mercy. And thus, when freed from all doubts, he steadily progresses towards his destined abode, which is directly under the protection of my spiritual energy of unadulterated bliss. That is the ultimate perfectional goal of the living entity. After giving up the present material body, the mystic devotee goes to the transcendental abode and never comes back. So here some very important points are there. So actual self-realization means becoming a pure devotee of the Lord. So the existence of a devotee implies the function of devotion and the object of devotion. So the devotee is there. When a devotee is there, there is the Supreme Lord, and the process of connection is the devotion service. So self-realization ultimately means that to understand the personality of Godhead and the living entities. So to know the individual self and the reciprocal exchanges of loving service between the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the living entity, that is self-realization. So actual self-realization means understanding one's own self as we are living entities and position of the Supreme Lord and the process of connection between both, that is the devotional service. This is the actual self-realization. Now, devotional service is revealed to the pure devotee by the unlimited costless mercy of the Lord. So we see here, the Lord says that my devotee actually becomes self-realized by my unlimited costless mercy. So Lord gives unlimited costless mercy. Only by the Lord's mercy can one reach the stage of self-realization. And when one becomes free from all doubts, he gradually progresses towards his destined abode. So devotional service is revealed to the pure devotee by the Lord himself by his costless mercy. And only those who engage in devotional service with love and faith receive the necessary intelligence from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, so that gradually and progressively they can advance to the abode of the Personality of Godhead. The Lord himself states in Bhagavad Gita that he gives the intelligence to his devotee by which he comes back to the Lord's abode. So the Lord gives an intelligence to his devotee as to how by being fixed in the process of devotional service, the Lord gives the intelligence by which one can go back to his abode by advancement in devotion, in the path of devotional service. The next important point is this impersonal Brahman effulgence also rests on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And that is bodily effulgence of the Lord and that is also called Kaivalya or impersonal Brahman. Now, in that impersonal Brahman effulgence, there are also spiritual planets which are known as Vaikunthas, chief of which is Krishna Loka. So some devotees are elevated to these planets, some are elevated to Krishna Loka. According to the desire of a particular devotee, is offered a particular abode. Now, when devotees start practicing Krishna consciousness, they also develop desires to render service to different incarnations of the Lord. Some may worship Krishna, some may worship Rama, some may worship Narsimhadev. Each of them have so many planets which are all situated in the Vaikuntha planets. So the Lord awards a devotee residence in his abode to enjoy transcendental relationship with his devotee in any of these planets, according to the desire of a particular devotee. So by the grace of the Lord, the self-realized devotee engages in devotional service, understands his destination even in this material body. So by practicing devotional service, one can understand even his relationship with the Lord, what is the mellow that he is enjoying, and what is his destination. He therefore performs his devotional activity steadily without doubting, and after quitting his material body, he at once reaches his destination for which he has prepared himself. And after reaching that abode, he never comes back to this material world. See, we all have a lot of material goals. For example, somebody might be working in a corporate world. You might be thinking that in the next 5 years or 10 years, I must become a CEO, either of a big company or a mid company or a small company. So people have goals. So similarly, when one comes to understand the importance of devotional service, one sets spiritual goals in his life. And gradually over a period of time, by the Lord's costless mercy, one understands his position in this devotional service, and one can realize his destination also. And here the Lord says, one attains by my grace, by my costless mercy, those spiritual planets. And after quitting this material body, one reaches those destinations by which one never comes back again to this material world. So the subtle body is made of mind, intelligence, false ego, and contaminated consciousness. And the gross body is made up of the gross elements like earth, water, fire, and ether. So when one is transferred to the spiritual abode, he gives up both the gross and subtle bodies of this material world. He enters the spiritual sky in his pure spiritual body and is stationed in one of the spiritual planets. So this is the process that is given here. Then there is a mention that also the impersonalists also reach the spiritual sky after giving up subtle and gross material bodies, but they are not placed in the spiritual planets. Like I mentioned, many of them want to enter the impersonal Brahma Jyoti. They want to become one with the Lord, which I mentioned in the beginning of the class. Such impersonalists are given entry into the impersonal Brahma Jyoti. In this impersonal Brahma Jyoti, there is no activity of performing service to the Lord. So they may remain there for some time, but when there is no activity, one becomes frustrated. Imagine if one is put into 4 walls of a room and he is locked inside without any activity. He may remain for some time, but gradually he becomes frustrated. So what happens? He wants to get out. So when one enters the impersonal Brahman effulgence and comes out, he may have to come back to this material world again. So that is why it is said that they are not placed in the spiritual planets as they are allowed, but after from the spiritual effulgence, they may come back to this material world. As a living entity prepares himself, so he attains his abode. The impersonal Brahman effulgence is offered to the impersonalists, but those who want to associate with Supreme Godhead in his transcendental form as Narayana, in Vaikuntha or Krishna Loka, go to these abodes from they never return. So depending upon one desire of activity, the Lord awards him the abode and also the service. And then we come to the last sloka for the day. It says, when a perfect yogi's attention is no longer attracted to the byproducts of mystic powers, which are manifestations of the external energy, his progress towards me becomes unlimited, and thus the power of death cannot overcome him. So here, before concluding this chapter, the Lord is explained to Mother Devahuti. Generally, yogis become attracted to the many byproducts of this mystic power. For example, there are Anima, Lahima, and so forth. There are 8 mystic perfections. They can become smaller than the smallest or even greater than the greatest. Achieve anything they desire. The yogis have also power even to create a planet or bring anyone under their control, under their subjection. So these are all these yogis who are generally who get attracted to these byproducts of this mystic power. But yogis who have incomplete information of the result of devotional service are attracted to these powers. But these powers are material and they have nothing to do with spiritual progress. So whatever powers that one might try to attain, so many try to practice yoga and other things to attain these powers, but they don't have the understanding of the power of devotional service and they get attracted by these powers. What happens is that many times when one practices devotional service, the Lord empowers living entities, may not be to attain these powers, but one might feel that after a period of performing devotional service, he has got some empowerment. But all these material empowerment, they are all temporary in this material world. Nothing is permanent. They have nothing to do with spiritual progress at all. So as other material powers are created by the material energy, similarly, all these mystic powers are also material. So a perfect yogi's mind is not attracted by any material power, but is simply attracted by unalloyed service to the Supreme Lord. So as long as one practices devotional service to attain even these mystic powers, he is a mixed devotee and continues to be in the cycle of birth and death in this material world, if not in this planet, maybe higher planets, and they can then again go down to lower planets. So in this way, one might go down in a circle from the topmost planet Brahmaloka to the bottom planet of Patalaloka. So one might go on in this cycle. But for a devotee, the process of merging into the Brahman effulgence is considered to be hellish. So for a devotee who he does not consider prospective to enter into the Brahman effulgence, he rather considers it to be hellish because there is no activity. And yogic power or preliminary perfection of yogic power to be able to control the senses automatically achieved. Or rather, when one performs devotional service, automatically all these preliminary powers are already achieved by controlling one's senses. So many times we see people perform Ashtanga Yoga and they try to control the mind and senses and all these things, which is generally not possible, very difficult in this Kali Yuga. And they may try to do this to attain some powers, but all these powers are also temporary. As for elevation to higher planets, a devotee considers this to be simply hallucinatory. That means for a devotee who wants to seriously satisfy the Lord, even he considers elevation to the higher planets to be an illusion. A devotee's attention is concentrated only upon eternal loving service of the Lord, and therefore a power of death has no influence over him. So a pure devotee is one whose only focus is on rendering service to the Lord for the Lord's satisfaction. And to such a person, the power of death has no influence over him. So this way, one should try to practice devotional service very seriously, by which one can reach a stage of becoming a pure devotee, whereby he has no desire for anything material opulence, including mystic power or going to the higher planets. At that stage, death has no influence over him. That means material nature has no effect on him, and he goes back to the spiritual abode only to render service to the Lord for the Lord's service. Thereby, he becomes fully independent and enjoys transcendental bliss and pleasure. So with this, I conclude the class for the day. Next couple of minutes, I can take some questions and answers if you have. Questions or comments if you have. Sorry.